Okay, to get started.
All right, thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me well. Today's talk is on the OODA loop. Like I said, I've been talking about the OODA loop for quite some time, and you'll see why in a second. By holistic, I mean it's basically a systems theory or a systems approach to security, and I think we have no choice but to think at higher levels because the threat is actually needed to be included in our calibration. It's sort of a co-evolution going on. But again, let's get started with the talk, and I look forward to the questions and answers. So cybersecurity. Let's take a quick retrospective for those of you who've been doing this as long as I have. A lot of things have changed since maybe 20 years ago. When if you started back in the 90s doing this stuff, a lot of the attacks were pretty fragmented. A lot of it was for notoriety, and they're pretty simple compared to today. They were pretty simple to combat. The threat was more deterministic because it was code and it was machines coming after you. A lot of what we saw was a lot of automated attacks by machines. So in turn, the countermeasures could be mechanized and handled by machines. In the beginning, again, the exploits had a directionality to them. They got pushed to the servers. The servers, of course, were stationary. The threat was very mobile. The whole strategy there was you'd scan, you'd find a vulnerability, you'd exploit, you'd push the exploit to the victim. That has actually changed. And I think one of the more important aspects of the security strategies is the threat back then was mainly kind of a single-step process. Again, they wanted to claim that they hacked your machine, and to them that was the reward back in the day. Now things are different, and again the tactics were very overt, easy to detect. In fact, they almost wanted to be detected. I think it was very noisy, a lot of smash and grab types of tactics, and threat intelligence. I don't know if you remember, but back then it was somewhat optional. In fact, threat intelligence companies have kind of come and gone. Not really a real big section of the market, but that's severely changed. So again, I think today's security strategies, at least the ones that are somewhat effective, are holistic, or they're a very system theory approach. Important not only from all of your dynamic systems, but I think the strategies these days must include the adversary. Leaving the adversary out of the picture, I think, is a big mistake. And frankly, the adversary and the threat has become a cost of just doing business. I think that that threat today, because it's both human and machine, I think it's much more adaptive. I think it's much more customized. Anybody's been hit in the past 2 years by anything of an advanced threat knows this intimately. I think that most of the initial infiltration these days has changed. The directionality has become more of a pull. Enterprise mostly pull in their exploits. So that's actually an interesting dynamic. I think that's again a sign of the coevolution. I think it's become much more expensive to push exploits to the enterprise, and because of that, You know, you could pretty much put a line in the calendar right around when SP2 came out with their firewall, and you know, firewalls became almost fire suits for the endpoints. It just got harder to get at the target surface. So so no problem. You know, the adversary just changes their strategy, and now it's just too easy to pull in all kinds of bad things. Here's an interesting one, and I'll touch on this later in the slide too. The multi-step exploits. There's, you know, call them whatever type of chain you want, but even malware itself is at the very least a 3-step process. So here's an interesting thing for everyone on the call. You know, there's always that economics people talk about where you may have 2,000, 3,000 vulnerabilities, and you have to find them all and fix them. But the saying is that the adversary only needs to find one. The opposite is true when you think more holistically, because if you can turn that on their heads, you can basically say that while the adversary has to be successful at their multi-step process, meaning all along their chain during their exploits, you, the defender, only have to be successful at stopping them at one. Hopefully, it's the one before the last step where they do the exfiltration. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. And the covert tactics, you know, the concentration now with a lot of the adversary's tooling isn't necessarily infiltration. It's really the ability to stay hidden. It's the reason why the P in APT stands for persistence. They can get in, and they have multiple ways of getting in, but it's actually when they're in an operational phase that they need to stay hidden. If you make it hard for them to hide, and you again, you know, using the OODA loop, I'll show what that looks like. You actually change the economics drastically for their operation. And again, you know, you want to catch them in operation and not necessarily at the end when, you know, surprise your source code just got pasted up on a paste bin. That is a form of detection, not the one I would prefer. And lastly, you know, threat intelligence I think is mandatory. Again, if we're really going to talk about this as a holistic strategy, we have to have a sort of a co-evolutionary position with the adversary. They innovate, we innovate, round and round we go. So, you know, again, continuous evaluation of your strategy is needed. I think it's, you know, business people know this. You know, you may have market share, but that doesn't last forever. You know, you're constantly questioning your company's tactics and strategies, and I think that type of mindset really needs to get down to security leadership. So again, I just want to qualify the word holistic because it just comes with so much semantic baggage. When I use the term holistic strategy, I'm talking about a way of framing the concept at a meta level, and this is why I've actually used the OODA loop so much, mainly because its simplicity is so beautiful, and it socializes well across communities where not everyone's an expert. When I talk about holistic telemetry, it's a concept of being data complete. It's not necessarily that you have deep data, it's that you have complete data of all sort of metadata across your network. And I'll go into what that means in terms of a data set and how that can become feasible at scale. And I don't care how big your network is, it is actually feasible to do this sort of enterprise-wide telemetry. And then lastly, while that data set is quite large, it's useful if you, it's actually useless, I'm sorry, if you can't understand it. So the concept of data versus information versus knowledge. I'll get into some of that. Okay, so how best to frame conflict? This is sort of the cognitive framework that we need to establish so that we can socialize this thing we call information security across the business. How does it become a pervasive business process? As I said before, I think it's a mistake not to include the adversary, not to include the threat in cost, in routine, in exercise. I think threat modeling is an essential part of doing business. I can't name one supply chain strategy that doesn't take into account operating too thin, or something happening to a couple of suppliers where they are resilient because they have accounted for these failures. The other thing there is that all of these processes, if you draw it out in Visio and you draw it out in whatever on a whiteboard, and it doesn't look like a loop, I would put $5 down that it's probably wrong. I think that in this day and age, no matter what you're doing in information technology, that the loop that goes between human and technology, or even between different subsystems within your infrastructure, is a continuous loop. And again, I reach for the OODA loop to sort of evaluate those loops. So, we are not, certainly we're not the first to talk about describing a framework for a very dynamic system. You can go back through Eastern culture. I really like Musashi a lot. He wrote a book called The Five Rings. But he's been, military history in this understanding of conflict. And the one we're here to talk about today is a concept that Colonel John Boyd introduced. He passed away in 1997. But when he was in his prime, he was a fighter pilot. And he earned the nickname 42nd Boyd, mainly because he would challenge all his students to a contest. He would say that within 40 seconds, no matter how they were oriented in the sky, that within 40 seconds he would be in that pilot's six, so he would be behind that pilot, which is not where you want your adversary to be. And if he lost, he would pay them $40. So that was the bet, and rumor is that he never lost. So since he was so good at his craft, and he was getting older, and I guess when you get older, you get wiser, and he was very good at documenting his work and his craft. And a lot of his theories actually went into the design of some just astronomically effective fighter jets, the F-15, the F-16. If you go on the internet and you type in John Boyd, and you type in winning and losing or destruction and creation, there's some PDFs floating around out there in the public domain, and you get a real sense of his passion for trying to actually describe why he never lost at this game that he invented in the skies. And it turns out that he kind of boiled it down to this thing called the OODA loop, and it's again very, very simple. It consists of a continuous cycle of 4 phases, and it's been used in a lot of things. In pharma, it's been used in business, it's been used in all kinds of domains, because I think just humans understand these phases very, very well, and they find it very actionable. So let's go into that for a second. Again, the 4 phases consists of observe, orient, decide, and act. And again, you know, everybody can remember 4 things, so it's very nice to kind of use as a framing. And furthermore, the 4 phases can be really classified into, I think, 2 different types of behaviors. The intelligence phase is really where the observation and orientation takes place. In human cognition, you know, even if you set up a sensor between the eyeball and the brain, you would just get data. You would just get the observation. And that observational set doesn't really have meaning or understanding yet. You have to get to the brain where there is a epistemology, there's a mental model, there's previous observations, there's things like that make sense of the data. And then, you know, again, in the human condition, we go to the phase where there's execution. So we then, the understanding then drives a decision, and then it drives an action. So the action usually is something we act upon the world and make a change, leading to, again, a change in a different observation, and round we go. So that, in its simplest form, is what the OODA loop is all about. If you were to double-click on it and really get pretty academic to it, you know, people have taken it to a much more complicated loop, and I would say that you know, if you need it, if you need this resolution, and it better fits how you're applying the OODA loop, then, you know, by all means, you know, use this diagram. It might actually be what you need. But for the purpose of information security, at least at a high level, the 4 phases actually works out quite well. So again, just to exemplify what I mean in sort of you versus bad guy, let's say you're blue and bad guys are red. I'll start out with bad guy, I guess. So bad guy is going to observe your network. They're going to orient themselves. They're going to decide to run a specific campaign on you, and then they take action, right? So their action is then observed by you, the blue team. You orient somehow. You decide and you act. Now, the whole answer to the riddle is, you know, spin your loop faster than your adversary. Okay, and right now it's pretty obvious that the adversaries are spinning their loop faster than we are. I mean, it's if your observation and orientation comes at the time that your customer data is actually found on one of the dark nets, your loop is so slow that, I mean, they may have turned their loop about 100 times before you've just gotten to the observation and orientation phase. So this would be a bad thing. And the opposite is actually very, very true. And I'll explain this. If the observation and orientation it basically increases your perceptive boundary. Okay, so let me explain that just a little bit. If you're able to sort of observe and orient faster than your adversary, there's a term called superior situational awareness, and that is basically knowing. It's a knowledge game, if you will. So you have superior knowledge over your target systems and your operations more so than your adversary, and this actually raises their costs. The sampling rate of the observation and orientation is relative to the rate of change. So the way I like to think about that is, let's just pick a starting point. Let's say that you think that things on your network change on a daily basis. So what I would say to you is I would make sure that you have a refresh rate of all of the observations that you want to perform to at least a 12-hour window, at least maybe half of what you think the rate of change is. Now, interestingly enough, if you start plotting that out and you see no change, then maybe you can actually decrease your sampling rate. But if things are moving around, I would encourage you to start to decrease your sampling rate. Maybe go to every 6 hours, or every 2 hours, or maybe even every hour. The telemetry that we deliver on networks, the checkpoints happen every minute. And that, again, I'll show you how that's feasible in a second. But again, we are just talking basic signal theory here. If you want a representation of that signal, you're going to have a sampling rate that is at least 2.5 times the actual frequency you're actually trying to represent. All right, so your decision and actions raise the cost to your adversary's observation orientation. And again, because we're thinking, in that previous image where you saw red versus blue, I mean, it's pretty easy to say that if you were to somehow change your environment, I don't know, let's say that you're changing your environment on a daily basis, a 24-hour period. And let's say that your adversary, in order to get a good picture of what's going on, let's say that it takes them a day and a half. It's actually in that margin of 12 hours that you've created this sort of what I call a knowledge margin. And it's the fact that they can't actually map to the appropriate target space before you actually change that target space. So again, it's an idea that the OODA loop makes very, very visible, in that if your rate of change is actually faster than what your adversary can observe and understand, they have to recompute their mental model of your target space, and that's very costly for them. So just think about that. It really is a knowledge game that you're playing with your adversary. Most of the time, you're just so stationary that they can make guesses that are true for years and years, and this is not a good thing. Again, the OODA loop in any discipline teaches us to try and operate at a faster tempo. Tempo matters. The faster you can turn your OODA loop, the more resilient you are, and I think that's pretty clear by now. So ultimately, it's an economics game. You're trying to make it more expensive for the adversary to operate and hide. Okay, this is actually very, very true in nature with prey species. Because they have no offensive measure, they choose this as the dominant strategy because they want to change the economics of the predator's observation and orientation. I'm not going to get into that this talk, but it's definitely another talk. Very interesting, because you as a information security expert, defender of your systems, you're kind of a prey species. You're going to have to find resiliency in ways that prey species seek resiliency. And there's a ton of OODA loop framing, or seeing nature through an OODA loop, I think is a really good thought experiment for another time. All right, let's see where we're at. 24 minutes. Okay, so data complete. I'm just going to talk about this for a second, because people are careless in how they talk about data versus information, and I want to be very, very clear. I think as security professionals, we need to really make this clear. So telemetry is what we call sort of how we know what's going on with the machines and with systems, right? You put in some source of telemetry at some logical level, Um, for us, I'm going to keep it to, understanding network infrastructure and what it takes to do that. If you have a multi-sensor approach here, you essentially give the adversary no place to hide, both in space and time. So flows are a way to do accounting on a IP network. IPs, of course, MAC addresses, these are all facets that are in the data. But when I talk about no place to hide in space and time, space being, making sure that every transit device, everything that is on the wire can exhibit the accounting, the flows, and that it's unsampled flow data coming to you, because you don't want to miss anything in time. Either one of these gives the adversary a place to hide and persist, and we want to change that. Metadata as context, so the idea that you stitch in user data and application data into those flows, making a richer context to the corpus of information that we'll later use for information and knowledge. And again, going back to the OODA loop and using that terminology, the observation of data, right? You just want it to be complete, both in space and time. And the orientation of information, meaning how does data become information? Well, it's actually when it's synthesized well with other sets of data. So the user-centric or app-centric view of your telemetry, I think, is very important for certain people to make sense of that data set. So I'll put together this slide just to kind of show the logical levels. Data is incredibly atomic. They're just things out there, and I'm a firm believer that information is observer-centric. I think that you, as an individual, make sense of data in your own special way. I may be close to how I make sense of data, but it's through conversation that we figure that out. That's just what we do as a craft. So, information, I think, is when you synthesize data sets together and you produce this sort of hybrid. You may want to look at the data being IP-centric or application-centric. This is all driven by what your craft is. So, you may be an audit, and your world is all, basically user-centric, because it's the user that legal and audit centers their world. They have a user-centricity model of the world, whereas in IT, they have a IP address-centric version of the world, or maybe an application-centric version of the world, where the application is the data centricity, and that everything else is metadata. But I just wanted to show this because there is a loop, shocker, that goes from synthesis to analytics. So data is synthesized together into information. The knowledge of the craft is analytic, meaning it's a deductive process that breaks it down. You drill into it, you have more insight, which drives more synthetic processes, and round we go. And that's pretty much intelligence, I think, summed up in a nutshell. So the holistic cyber security, again, I just put this slide together to summarize, but you have data, information, and knowledge. And again, that pretty much is the observation and orientation phase. So again, as I spoke before, the OODA loop consisting of two different phases here, the blue being the intelligence phase, the orange here being the decision and action. And just kind of a skip into the future here, as we're able to instrument change through things like EC2's control plane or a software-defined network, you basically have a situation where a lot of this observation and orientation is going to be able to drive actions on the network in a way that is not so dangerous. And what I mean by that is, SDN and cloud gives us a control plane that is very deterministic. We can do automation, semi-automation there. Logically, you could see that you could immediately sort of quarantine a malicious endpoint. You could separate the bad traffic from the good traffic. You could keep bots at bay. I mean, there's all kinds of things, trickery you could do at the network level to instrument some action on the network. And again, to change the observations back into the orientation, and round we go. So I think the instrumentation that we use today, once we get to a very application-centric way of doing IT, which is what software-defined networks will bring to us, I think we're going to see a big change. And people are saying, well, SDN, well, that's going to take forever. I would argue it's already happening. There's nothing about Amazon's web services that isn't SDN. You talk to a controller, a central controller, you can do incredibly magnificent things there. Everybody who is watching a movie on Netflix is experiencing the benefit of what isn't called SDN but acts like SDN. So, so it's coming, and it's just going to maybe come closer to your data center. Right now, it's in Amazon's data center. All right. So, OODA loop and the kill chain. I'm going to spend probably the next 5 minutes here just giving an idea of what this looks like. I kind of talked about it on my first slide about infiltration operations, and then let's say exfiltration. And then I'll give a few examples of what that looks like with the instrumentation of NetFlow and IPFix, and we'll go into that and then get questions, okay? So all of the attacks begin with some kind of infiltration. And in fact, at my previous job, I spent 13 years making it more expensive for people to infiltrate networks. And while that's very important, again, we're talking system theory. What we're seeing right now is a concentration on exfiltration, right? That's their end game. But all the while, there are many steps that I'm just calling the adversaries operations. So infiltration, operations, and exfiltration. And you can make any amount of blocks here, but essentially, this is some kind of kill chain. Okay, and when I said that while there may be thousands of access vectors for infiltration, and all the adversary needs to find is one, the opposite is true here, which is while they have to complete, in this case, be successful at 7 different phases on your network, you only need to find them in one, okay? So that's a completely flipping the economics on its head. And I really invite you to get good at that, because making it harder for them to operate is really going to change the dynamics here. So here's the OODA loop, right? So in the reconnaissance phase, ask yourself, what kind of observation and orientation do I need so that I can decide and act and kill them right there? Well, let's say you miss that. Okay, so on the exploitation, what kind of observation and orientation is demanded at this phase? Is it in the network? Is it on the endpoint? And what decision and action can I take to kill them at that phase? Well, let's say you miss it there. And so on and so forth, right? You can see here that all the while, especially in this middle group, where we're deeming it operations, I don't care if they're encrypted or whatever they're doing. They still have to pass a packet on the network, okay? And some of those things stick out like sore thumbs. It's just like nobody's looking at it. And that's really the sin. It's not expensive to find them there. It's just nobody's got the flashlight to shine it, to catch them. And unfortunately, you know, they catch them over here where the stuff's already left the gate, and that is not good. So, quick recap on what I'm talking about when I talk about NetFlow or IPFix, right? So your network infrastructure is talking to you. It's talking to you in a metadata level called NetFlow, and in some cases IPFix. It's a unsampled general ledger of everything that's going on in the network, and it's really the ideal. It's like a sweet spot for observation because it scales into incredible levels. We have some customers that are running NetFlow pervasively across in their entire infrastructure. I'm talking millions of flows per day, right? Not a problem, not a problem. So total visibility, right, across, you know, edge to access and everywhere. So no place for them to hide. And we've put together a product called StealthWatch that basically performs all the orientation. The observation without the orientation is painful. It's just painful. Nobody needs more data. Let me tell you that. So, you know, be careful what you ask for when you ask for data, because nobody wants big data. They want small, relevant information, and that's the game we're trying to play here. All right. So data observation. I'm going to just make a analogy to a call detailed record versus tapping your landline, right? The call detail record is something where you have a time, you have who called whom, you have all these things that are put in place. It's shared with the customer. It's collected by the vendor so that you can actually be billed for your calls, or there's some accounting for your calls. The phone company never actually, you know, I don't want to say never, okay, but they don't naturally tap your line and listen to your conversation, meaning they don't need the payload. They just need the header and metadata, okay? That's exactly, when I say NetFlow and I say IPFix, which is the IETF version of NetFlow, I'm specifically talking about that layer of abstraction. This is what a flow table looks like. You have the client, you have the server, you have these zones you can annotate in here. You know, this is the call detail record to your entire network. Now that has two benefits. One is you get around a lot of the privacy issues because you're not really looking at payload, okay? I mean, you're not. You're just looking at transactions, and you're looking at byte counts in aggregate. You're not looking into, you know, what the file is or anything of that nature. In fact, if you're really running your network well, this stuff is all encrypted. So you're not going to be able to get to that anyway, okay? So again, this sort of call detail record in an IP network is called NetFlow or IPFix. All right, so from that, just a couple more slides. Now, I just want to show you what getting that data set and running algorithms on it is the important part, okay? So I just want to show you just a couple of things that are just dumb obvious, okay? If you're looking at this and you're seeing this giant spike, okay, and basically you're saying, wow, that's odd, okay? This is, oh, wait, it's going to the Ukraine? So this is what I'm talking about, okay? 350 megs to the Ukraine. You see this on your network. It's probably time, you know, you're probably late in the kill chain, but the fact of the matter, nobody has this in front of them. And so the only time they actually figure this out is probably years later after, you know, there's a bunch of these bumps that went undetected, right? Not a good thing. Time of day orientation. So Again, when you're dealing with insider threat and you're dealing with people who have credentials, when you look at that kill chain again, there's early in that kill chain, they didn't even trigger a security event. So we have dashboards and we're watching firewall logs and we're watching, access deny logs, and there's none of that in the kill. They have somebody's credentials. They're in your network. The only way you're going to see them is if you have, algorithms running on these behavioral things, right? So, this is a trick that credit card companies do, right? How can you be in Boston and Atlanta within an 18 minutes period? I mean, it's just never going to happen. So again, behavioral anomalies that, again, if you're looking for it, it'll stick out like a sore thumb. All right, there's a guy, it starts with an S and it rhymes with Odin, that this would have just made his day very, very bad. So data hoarding is an algorithm, again, that you're making sense of the data, again, and the orientation provided here is you're seeing that, that this one machine is stockpiling an exorbitant amount of information. And you can set these thresholds up, but let me tell you, when you have a threshold of 100 megabytes and something has been observed at 10 gigabytes, I mean, how dumb simple is that, right? I mean, that should be the biggest red flag ever. Is there anybody looking for this stuff? No. So again, it's a good time to be data hoarding these days because nobody's got the flashlight to find it. Data disclosure, so that again, the idea that 350 megs left your network. There are algorithms that run continuously in the product that do this suspect data loss. And again, pretty dumb simple, right? We're not talking about splitting hairs here. The difference between 8 gigs and 500 megabytes